What's up, everybody? You're listening to another episode of Composer Code. It's Matt here. It's been a while since we've been on the airwaves. We're doing something a little special today. I got my buddy 8-Bit Music Theory on the horn with me today, all the way from Manitoba. And we're going to talk a little bit about analyzing and transcribing music because, truth be told, 8-Bit's channel, 8-Bit Music Theory, was the biggest catalyst for me to really see the power of transcription and analysis and what it does for musicians, composers, arrangers, how it helps you in so many different ways. And I think just in our conversations and obviously studying your channel and asking you questions, my eyes have been so open to like, this is the closest thing to a superpower I think that musicians can have as far as analyzing and really diving deep into the minds of other composers, because it's even better than having a composer as a teacher sometimes, because sometimes those teachers or those composers might not be great teachers. But if we can dive in and we can look at their stuff and we can sort of teach ourselves how they thought and how their mind works, it empowers us for greater composition. I'm curious what you have found to be, Mr. Bit, what you have found to be the biggest or some of the biggest influences or enhancements to your own musicianship, because you are a musician, as we talked about in my last interview with you almost a year ago, believe it or not.
Wow.
And so I'm curious how has it helped you, man? What have you noticed that transcription does for you?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the as far as learning how to compose and learning how music works. It's a lot better than a teacher in a lot of respects, because I mean, I guess they're a little different, but even if you're a great composer, you don't necessarily know why or how you have composed what you composed. It's kind of like that thing of if you're writing a novel, you're not supposed to know what you're writing about really until it's done, sort of. So I think like being able to go back and see, well, because I'm kind of all over the place right now, but I first learned about transcription as in the context of learning how to solo in a jazz context. So in school.
No, but I thought you mentioned that you had transcribed a bunch of stuff in high school. Like you were just transcribing video game music in high school.
True. That's a good point, actually. I forgot about that. I did.
I know more about you than you do.
Yeah, apparently.
As the job as is the job of a fanboy. Anyway.
I was just thinking like the absolute very, very first things I ever transcribed were drum parts to songs that I wanted to play on drums. Yeah. Just because you can't buy drum sheet music for hardly anything, especially not like in 2006 when I was doing this. So I would just like, I want to play drums to this Fall Out Boy song, so I'll transcribe the drums, and so you transcribe a bunch of drum parts and you do it very badly and they're not quite right. And but then I think that starts the ear training as far as just the skill of listening for something and being able to put it down on paper. And then that turned into, I like this video game song, I'll transcribe it for fun. And then that turned into, but as far as like transcription as a valuable asset, the first time that I thought of it as any more than just like a fun way to pass the time was in jazz school, as like, you want to learn how to solo, you have to transcribe solos and figure out what they were doing and try and do it yourself. And it wasn't until, towards the end of my degree that I kind of figured like, if it's, soloing or improvisation is really just composition on one instrument in real time. So if you can learn how to solo by transcribing other solos, you can probably learn how to, write a song by transcribing other songs or that idea. So
yeah.
So I started to take it more seriously.
How many transcriptions do you think you've done? Because I know we've talked about you have like a massive library of transcriptions on your computer, obviously, because of your channel. It necessitates you to transcribe so much. How many do you think you've done? I think you counted it for me a while ago, but I think you've done a lot since then.
That would take a while to figure
Like,
out.
is it hundreds, 500s,
It's
200?
it's hundreds for sure. It's in the hundreds.
Yeah.
I don't know
amazing.
I don't know. I should count sometime and just take the day off and count all the. Well, because if you know, on my computer here, like I have my video game music transcription folder that has about 47 folders, so 47 different games. And then
Wow.
inside of each of those folders is between like 2 and 20 transcriptions. So
That's so cool.
and then that's video games. So then I also have like jazz solos and you know, arrangements, different arrangements that I've, you know. So I don't know. It's in the hundreds probably, but I can't give a real answer, I guess.
That's amazing. So I want to jump in. So part of this show, for those of you listening, is what I want to do is I was so inspired and just hypnotized. Not hypnotized. What's the word? Enchanted by 8-Bits by our previous talk, and just the value of transcription and how he analyzes it. And I mean, we've had tons of conversations about how you analyze music, because there's just so many different ways, and there's not like one agreed upon way. And that I just find so fascinating, the transcription and then also just the analysis piece. So I want to talk about, like, you know, you mentioned to me earlier that when you're analyzing music, it's important to have a goal, right? When you transcribe, your transcription's done. You've tried to get it as accurate as possible to the recording, and you want to analyze it. What are some examples of maybe some goals that you've had or that you've seen some other people have? And for people who want to get started in transcription and analysis, let's say they transcribe a piece, what are maybe some examples of some goals that maybe they could take on to try to learn from the transcription?
That's such a good question. I think, well, because for me right now, I usually think in terms of what can I make a video on. So my goals might be a little different than like if you're trying to compose. But
Sure.
so, you know, usually my main three like categories are, you know, melody, harmony, arrangement. And so if I'm transcribing something, like if I, you know, sometimes I start with an idea like, oh, I wonder how you write a good melody. So I'll transcribe some stuff that I think have good melodies. Sometimes I start with a game or a song where, oh, this is a cool song, or, oh, I should do this game. You know, I transcribe it. And then, you know, you kind of look like, is the melody cool? Is the melody doing something interesting? Is the harmony cool? Is it doing something interesting? Or is the arrangement worth looking at? Can you learn something from that? And within those three categories, there are, you know, tons and tons and tons of subcategories of, like, say you want to write better melodies. You think your melodies are boring. Okay. So start analyzing, like, you know, what about this melody do you like? And why do you think it is like that? You can look at, like, how the melody interacts with the chords, if they're hitting chord tones, or how it works rhythmically, if it's like emphasizing certain beats, or there's, you know, it's such an open-ended question. It's hard to give it's hard to give a definite answer, but yeah.
That's awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit later about melodic reduction, which I think is amazing. And it's my favorite video of yours, is what makes the Mario songs Christmassy. I love that video. I always come back to it. It's like Old Faithful. It brings a tear to my eye just thinking about it. So I want to talk about that in a little bit. But before we do, I want to go and I want to look at an actual piece of music with you. I want to go down into the nitty gritty, and so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show my screen, and I'm going to look at your transcription of the Super Mario Bros. Theme. Of course, it's the most iconic piece of music probably in all of media. And so I'm curious, when you transcribe a piece like this, and you can see, you know, you've got your chord symbols here, you know, I would love to talk a little bit about, before we go into the analysis piece, actually, when you're naming chords, because, you know, I've talked with you about this and, like, banged my head against the wall trying to understand, like, chord naming philosophy. And I've written a blog post on this, which kind of takes some of your wisdom and puts it in a blog post. And so for those of you interested on naming chords, I'll put that in the show notes. But can you talk to me a little bit about like how you would go about naming chords, kind of at a high level, maybe looking at this piece as an example?
This piece is a really good example to use, actually, because like all NES music, there's only 3 voices. And so it can be really hard to have, full chords when you're writing a piece with only 3 voices, because you need a melody, you need a bass line, and then you have one extra voice that's trying to do everything, that's not a melody and a bass line. So, so it can be hard to have like real fleshed out harmony. So there's a lot of tunes will hint at harmony or imply a harmony, and then, excuse me. So, for example, for this tune, like the very first 2 measures, whatever. I'm not good at piano, but
Done.
So, that's so the 3 notes are D, F sharp, and E for the first note, and that's not a chord, really. Like that's a cluster technically, and the way they spread it out, or the way Koji Kondo spreads it out over like such a huge range, he's clear, like me looking at that, I can see that he wants that, but he can only have 3 voices, so he just leaves like the bare minimum essentials. So basically what I do is look at the bass note.
So you're saying that he originally it would be a cluster, but the chord that you played was a D9. So can kind of back up. Can you tell me how you knew that he thought it was supposed to be what you played?
Yes, and the reason why is because you have to think 2 ways, kind of. You have to think functionally, and you have to think about what notes are on the page. So as far as notes on the page, we know the bass note is D, and then we have an F sharp. So immediately you're thinking D major, because D and F sharp.
Right. And so would you say that finding a third, because I know you've coached me on this before, finding a third is one of the most important things you can do early on, because thirds dictate the quality of the chord. Is that something that you're kind of looking for as you're going? Yeah,
that's definitely something you're keeping an eye out for. Like,
but they're not always there.
They're not always there, but if you it's like a flow chart where if you can find a third, then like most of your work's done for you, and if not, then you have to use other means. But if you can find a third, that's what you should stick with. So we have our D major sound, and then we have an E on top, which makes it technically a D add 2, if you want to call it that. But if you look at the whole bar, the melody drops down to has that C. So if you add that into the mix, then you get D, F sharp, C, E, and that's a D9 without the 5th.
Right.
You don't need the 5th ever.
Now let me ask you this: because of so you don't need the 5th. The 5th is sort of optional, and I've heard it said Koji Kondo gets an A+ for voicing here, because he voices everything in the priority that needs to be voiced. Right? He gets the 3rd in there, he gets the 9th in there, he gets the 7th in there, that sort of thing. So, are you also thinking like, okay, well, I know that a dominant to tonic relationship is going to be the strongest form of resolution here, so Koji's probably wanting there to be a dominant 7 in there. Are you also kind of having that in the back of your mind?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, you're looking at the notes on the page, but you're also thinking about how this chord functions. And it's really, when you listen to it, it's obvious that it's setting up the next chord in the next bar, which is just a G. Really straightforward. Once again, with no 5th. But and so if you're thinking like, some sort of D major to G, that is way more likely going to be a D7 to G than anything else, right?
Right. Makes total sense. So that's awesome. That's a fantastic exposition of the first 2 bars. I think that's fantastic. So moving on to the piece, let's say you wanted to make a video about this piece. When you look at this piece, you've often told me when you make videos, you wait for the music to sort of like jump out at you or tell you what to make, as far as like you're not trying to shoehorn in, okay, I want to make a video about melody or harmony. You're like, okay, what is this piece really, how does this piece really shine? So when you look at this piece, let's say you're making a video on this piece, what about this piece to you it just is really notable and stands out and maybe would be worthy of a video or an essay or some sort of exposition?
You know, some tunes have a lot more to look at than others. This one you could go a bunch of different ways with, I think. And that's partially why it's so well loved, is because it's so good and there's just so much to dive into. You know, it's a really catchy melody, and you know that because everybody knows the melody. So you could look at it in terms of what makes it so, you know, iconic. I guess a lot of my process is asking questions and then trying to see if any answers pop out. Like, or, you know, I don't know. It's interesting trying to think about this process in an abstract way, because a lot of it is kind of instinct or trial and error almost, of like, or even like just trying to apply things that I've picked up along my whatever career as a musician, of like, you know, if you just isolate the top voice, isolate the melody, and you look at the next 4 bars that you know, just looking at it and thinking like, what about this is weird? What about this is different? What about this doesn't show up in every other piece? You know, there's lots of stuff. There's lots of chromatic notes. Well, in the first 4 bars, there's only one chromatic note, but there's a chromatic note, which isn't super common. The range is huge. The range is of like an 11th from the lowest note in the melody to the highest note. The rhythm is completely different every bar. Like, you could talk about just the rhythm of this melody for probably a whole video, honestly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it all depends what you want to focus on. If you think if you're writing melodies and you think they lack, you know, interest, and you're like, well, I think they're too boring rhythmically, then you can, you know, well, how does Koji Kondo make his melodies exciting with rhythm? And, you know, it's right here. You can just look and see.
Yeah. That's so awesome. It's crazy. I want to talk a little bit about, why do you think nobody talks about transcription? Like, why are more people not talking about this? Like, I feel like when I talk about transcription, people are like, "Oh yeah, I've done that before. It's pretty cool." Or I did it in school and that was nice. You know, help me with it. But I'm like, dude, you guys don't understand. Like, it's almost like it's like this secret, and it's amazing when I discovered it, because I'm like, why does nobody talk about this? You know, like you just said, like, if you want to know why a melody is catchy, you just look at this melody and you study it, and people, they just don't want to do that. Why do you think people don't want to do that? Or, I mean, I guess people are kind of lukewarm on it, but why do you think people don't talk about it more?
I think it's like, well, first of all, I don't know. That's a great question. I wish I could tell you. But if I had to guess, like...
dang, I thought you had all the answers.
Yeah.
Shoot.
I think it's a couple of, like, I played in a lot of different circles, a lot of different genres. And a lot of different, like, you know, I played in garage rock bands. I've been in school, university for music. And so I think it kind of depends on who you're talking about. Like, rock musicians don't transcribe music because I think there's sort of an attitude of like, why do you want to play someone else's music, man? You know, like that's something I've encountered. And then in school, you know, if you're a classical musician, you're not doing much transcribing because most scores, pretty much every score you could ever want, is just online for free now. So why would you need to transcribe anything? And then, like I said, jazz musicians will transcribe solos and stuff like that. But jazz as a culture has never really been super into composition. Like, it's been more about taking other people's compositions and like trying to express yourself through improvisation. So yeah, I don't know if there's one good answer. I think maybe it's hard to do when you're first starting out. Like, you know, I remember my first, whatever, 50 drum part transcriptions as a kid drummer trying to figure out how to play tunes, just being a very long, very arduous process, and being mostly completely incorrect when I was finished. So I could see there being like a high barrier of entry to really getting into it. I found that
too. It's like people, I've talked to those people. I wrote the blog post about transcription, and I posted it in a few composer groups that I'm a part of, and people, had a mostly good responses to it. And one guy said, I love the idea of transcription, but it's just so hard and so boring. That's I totally empathize with you, man. I get it, but like, I'm just like, if you just press through to the end, the rewards that you get as a composer and as an arranger and stuff are just insane. But it's like, you have to press through, and you're right. I think people give up. They give up because it is really hard. We've talked about transcribing is like, afterwards you're like sweating. You need to take a nap. It's like, it really is so mentally exhausting to listen to something over and over and over and write it down.
Yeah, and it can be really discouraging when you come back to a transcription the next day and realize like, oh, I screwed up a bunch of stuff. It's so bizarre how when you're trying to transcribe for even 20 minutes, you just get tired and you're like, I've listened to this one pitch 30 times and I couldn't tell you if it's an E or like a G sharp. Like, I have no clue. Like, it's just, I don't know why that happens, but it's definitely a tiring.
It is. It's so true. Well, cool, man. So if possible, I'd love to move on to another famous tune. Let's do a Sonic 1 Scrap Brain Zone, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm curious about this tune, kind of switching franchises here. I love me some Masato Nakamura Sonic tunes. He's definitely the bomb. So when you're transcribing this song obviously, like, when you look at it initially, it looks very different than the Super Mario Bros. Song. When you look at this song, what about this tune kind of stands out to you as unique or praiseworthy or noteworthy?
Well, it's actually really interesting that you like comparing it to the Super Mario Bros. Theme. That can also be a way of figuring out what angle to analyze something from, is just comparing two tunes, because having that as a reference point and asking, what is different about this tune than the Super Mario Bros. Theme, already a bunch of stuff pops out of, like, the Super Mario Bros. Theme was obviously kind of melody first, and then every other voice was arranged to accompany the melody. Whereas this tune seems a lot more sort of groove oriented, which I'd say is a hallmark of Nakamura's writing in general, where you see, like, there's, at the A section there's the 16th note kind of pulsing bass ostinato rhythm thing, and the melody is just kind of floating over top, like a really simple open melody, not really rhythmically interesting or anything, just kind of, you look at the chords and the structure of the melody and even the structure of the bass line there. It's one 2-bar idea, and then he brings that 2-bar idea down a whole step, and then he brings that down a whole step. Like, it's very what's the word? Not formulaic, but like kind of what's the word? Not systematic.
I don't know, but I know there's like a classical term for it. Is that what you're thinking of? Or something
else? I can't think of the real. This is gonna bug me. But yeah, you get what I mean. It's it's like a sequential thing where it's like, here's an idea, we'll bring it down, same idea, bring it down, same idea,
And where it gets really interesting, right, is that F7, because a little bit of theory, like, the song is in the key of C, and there is technically no E flat in the key of C, but because this idea is brought down whole step, whole step, whole step, he continues it and sort of breaks out of the diatonic thing. So what do you think about that stuff?
Well, that just shows to me that he was thinking primarily about the bass line. Like, the bass line is kind of what's driving it, because prioritizing that from bar 1 and bar 2, it has that interval structure of going down from the 1 to the 5 up to the flat 7 down to the 5.
Okay.
And so that he preserves and moves that interval structure through the chords. And so that means that the third chord, the F, gets, has a chromatic note, one that's not in the key of A minor, and it's not one that has any real functional reason to be there if you're thinking like classically. And like it's not like F7 to A minor is a common chord progression. Like it's kind of weird, but
yeah.
But so that just shows that he was thinking about like this bass line and the groove and just keeping that consistent, which is an interesting choice.
Yeah, and sorry I misspoke there. Yeah, this is an A minor. Apologize about that. So I'm going down here to the B section, right? And I'm looking at this C to F sharp major 7 sharp 11. So what's happening there?
I remember transcribing this and just trying to figure out like what is going on. But in my humble opinion, it's an approach to the following F major chord. So you have, without that F sharp chord, you have a really typical 1 4 5 1 C F G C progression. And just to throw in a little curveball, he approaches the F with the chord a half step above. And when you hear it, that C, it like really stands out and really like turns your head of like, whoa, what's going on?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what he's going for. Like, let's just break out of the typical C major kind of sound.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's so jarring but cool, and when you listen to it, the da 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 da, it's just when you hear it over and over, it's like, of course that's what it's supposed to do, but when you see it on the page, it's like, that is weird.
And it's interesting to note again, like the bass line, he's altered the bass line from the A section, so now it's going from the root to the 5th to the 6th to the 5th of each chord. And there's another inner voice above the bass line that in the first bar is outlining a C major chord, and then the next bar is outlining a C sharp major chord over the F sharp bass note.
That is interesting.
So again, you can see he's thinking about just taking these parts and shifting them through the chords without necessarily caring about like, oh, how well does this fit together? And it ends up fitting together well because it sounds good. But you get this weird like C sharp major over F sharp major, which I would call like an F sharp major 7 sound. So that's what I labeled it. But yeah, you can kind of see his thought process almost by analyzing this tune.
So you said you heard it as an F sharp major 7 sharp 11. Like, are there other chords that it could have been? But like, how do you go about when you say like you hear something as an F sharp? What do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, there's certain cases where. Ooh, excuse me.
What? You just
I hope you can. I hope you can edit the recording.
I'm keeping that in.
I am very enchanting, like you said before.
Yes,
everyone will
are.
be able to see how enchanting I am.
You are so enchanting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's and I think some of the later tunes we're going to talk about showcase this a little bit better, even. But there's some situations where a chord won't be so straightforward to name. So in this one, you have a C sharp. One line is outlining a C sharp major triad. That's that middle voice that's going, whatever it is, and the bass line is very strongly outlined F sharp, and then the melody is kind of like, what is that? Why did I write it like that? See, that's interesting because there's a G natural in that bar too. So if you want to, that could really screw things up for my analysis. But I see that as kind of like anticipating the next bar, so I didn't really worry about it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, you could say like, oh, it's a C sharp over F sharp, or like a C sharp major 7 over F sharp. there's a few different, like for this bar specifically, I'd say it's either it's an F sharp major 7, but you could get away with calling it a C sharp over F sharp. But then there's some cases where it's really up to interpretation of like, well, I think that note's acting this way and he thinks it's acting that way, so we call them completely different chords.
Gotcha. That's so interesting. Yeah, there is so much subjectivity in chord naming, especially. I've found that there can be a lot of differences. Well, this is awesome, dude. I want to move on, if possible, to a simple but beloved tune, the Kakariko Village theme from Zelda. And I want to take this opportunity rather, as we talk about this tune, to talk a little bit about what I sort of alluded to a bit ago about melodic reduction, because I think it's super interesting. And I'll link, of course, this video in the show notes. But when you talk about the Christmassy songs, you talked a lot about how when you isolate these pitches on the strong beats or on the beats themselves, you start to notice patterns. When you sort of strip away maybe some of the syncopation and you strip away some of the notes that aren't on the strong beats, you start to see these very distinct patterns. And I believe in the Christmassy song that you were analyzing from Mario, there was a very distinct walk around the circle of fifths, which just blew my mind. This is so crazy to see that. It was like Illuminati confirmed, in the Mario song. So I'm curious, like, could you talk a little bit more about that and just, kind of spitball with me about melodic reduction and what it does and how it helps? And I would just love to hear your more thoughts on that.
Well, sure, absolutely. There's melodic reduction can make a piece of music that seems too complicated to analyze, or like if it has too much stuff going on, it can kind of strip it away into the backbone of what makes the song, how it's structured in a very formal, general sense. And a lot of times you'll see that, like, it's structured a lot. The structure is very simple. And so making that connection of like a very simple idea that's kind of blown out into a really complicated piece can help bridge that gap of like, I don't know how to write a really complicated piece, but I can make a really simple like skeleton for a piece, and then you can just work on making it more and more interesting. Yeah. So like for Kakariko Village, it's very easy to reduce melodically because every bar has like a really strong like half note melody note. And so if you isolate just the first beat of every bar, you get it's a B flat major triad. Right. So like, okay, so the melody is really going up a B flat major triad in the key of B flat. Like, how much more simple could you get, right? But then the way it does it of putting these big leaps in between each one of, you start on the root and then you approach the third, it like goes down a chord tone and then jumps up to the next chord tone. So like you start on the root, you step down to the chord tone below, the closest chord tone below it, which is the fifth, and then rock it up to the next chord tone above the root, the third, which is a very wordy way of saying something obvious. But and then it just follows that pattern, going forward. And so it's kind of interesting because you have this simple melodic framework of we're just going up the major triad, and he harmonizes it with a really simple like 1-6-2-5 chord progression, which is like a stock chord progression that everyone knows and uses. But it's interesting to me because, as you were saying before, you mentioned the circle of fifths. The chord progression is following the circle of fifths in a way of 6 to 2 to 5 is a circle of fifths movement to 1. And so you have that circle of fifths motion, but then you also have a triadic motion in the melody, which is separate, right? You're jumping up by thirds rather than fourths. So they're both really simple, but they kind of contrast each other in a really interesting way. And so even though the tune sounds simple, like it's a nice and it's supposed to, right? It's a peaceful village theme, right? It's not supposed to be too complicated. It's still interesting because there's enough stuff going on under the hood that it's not just like, you know, the chords are doing a really simple progression and then the melody is just confirming that progression exactly, which happens with a lot of sort of less interesting tunes, I'd say.
So when you say it's triadic, you mean while the circle, while the harmony is progressing in fifths, or I guess it would be, yeah, progressing in fifths. The melody itself is like progressing in thirds. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. It's progressing in thirds, and then you kind of see like the following bars 13 through that 8-bar chunk. You know, sort of the second half of the melody there, where it starts on that E flat.
Yeah.
That kind of switches it up a little bit, but it's still, you know, fundamentally going back down the major triad. So you walk up the major triad, you walk up the major triad again, then you hit the G down to the A, which is worth talking about. I'll come back to that in a second. Which is sort of an embellishment of the fifth. And then you go back 5, 3, 1. And this is really, really like really boiling the tune down to its very basic structure, like I did in that Christmas video. But you know, because you can take every bar like I was doing, but you can also look at every 2 bars and like what's the main note of every 2 bars of melody. And if you do that, the second half is just G, F, D, B flat, which is like a B flat 6 chord, or you could say the G is just embellishing, like an appoggiatura embellishing the F and then walking back down the triad. So really the melody is kind of like you start at home, you go up to the fifth away from home, and then you come back. It's a very simple idea. And it's simple, but it's, what's the word? Like, it's great. Like it's archetypal almost. Of like, that's all anyone wants from a piece of music is to like be home and then go away from home and then come back. So I'm not trying to knock it by saying it's simple. It's like, it's perfect. You know what I mean?
I'm almost crying thinking about it. That's just the way you put it is beautiful. Everybody wants to just, you know, be home and journey far away from home and then come back.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's all you need.
It's just human.
Yeah,
beautiful. I love it. Awesome. Fantastic. And like I mentioned, if anybody wants to follow along and check out these transcriptions, I'll have a link in the show notes to do that as well. So I want to do one more, and I want to check out a real stinker, as they say. The Requiem of Shield Knight. A real doozy. So Shovel Knight, if you're anyone listening is at all familiar with the soundtrack, is a retro. Shovel Knight is a retro platformer in the style of some of the 8-bit platformers of old, and it is composed by Jake Kaufman in a NES tracker, imposing the original limitations of the NES, but the some of the technical things that he does in this music is just insane. It's just insanity. And one of my favorite soundtracks of all time actually is the Spectre of Torment soundtrack for Shovel Knight, which is a remix of all the original Shovel Knight songs that Jake Kaufman did, and it is just absolutely insane. I mean, it is like just as good as any classical composer. I will go toe-to-toe with anyone on that. It is amazing. So talk to me a little bit about, I know you did a video on Shovel Knight, which I will also put in the show notes. You did a video on Shovel Knight, and tell me a little bit about that experience and kind of like what transcribing and analyzing the Shovel Knight soundtrack sort of taught you, and specifically this song.
Well, transcribing it was a lot of fun because it wasn't, you know, it was great because he actually released, because he wrote the whole soundtrack in an NES tracker, emulating like how you would write on an NES. He actually released the file with all of his like, it's called an NSF file with all of his music on it. So basically, I could download that and put it into a tracker and see exactly what he put into the tracker to make the music. So I had all the notes laid out right in front of me. So once I figured out how to read an NES tracker, because that's not super easy, I could be 100% sure that my transcriptions were accurate, because you could just look into it looks like code basically. You just look into the tracker and see like, oh yeah, that is a C# or whatever. Which wasn't necessarily faster than just transcribing by ear, but I wanted to make sure I was accurate, because there's so much stuff going on. There's so many voices and so many moving parts that it can be really hard to pick out everything that's happening just by ear. So
even just looking at this transcription, I'm like, where do you even begin to analyze this? Because I see so many voices that are just intersecting with each other, and it almost looks random, even though it's clearly not random. There's a lot of intention behind it. It's insane how how many notes are just going all over the place and crossing over and playing in unison and then going up and then back down and intersecting, and it's bonkers.
And I had a rough time figuring out how to write it down, even because I like to keep things on 2 staves if I can, but there was just too much going on for 2 staves. And then I had entertained the thought of blowing it out to 6 staves for every voice to have its own stave, because they're all moving independently pretty much, and they all are doing something interesting. And even on 3 staves here, it can be hard to tell which voice is moving where. But I didn't want it to be like a 30-page thing either. So but yeah, so on that note, like this tune especially, it's like almost like well, not almost, it is like counterpoint, like Baroque era contrapuntal music of like all the voices are moving totally independently. And so being able to look at it through that lens and see like, how does he weave these voices together. That was very educational.
Yeah.
And then also the reason why I wanted to transcribe this in the first place is because I just thought it was a beautiful, beautiful melody. And the reason why I think it's such a beautiful melody is because of its the way it interacts with the harmony in terms of chord tones versus non-chord tones. So like it does a lot of sitting on non-chord tones that are very colorful. And there's a lot of very colorful voicings. Like if you look at the first bar in that middle stave, there's the first like 4 notes of the tune are seconds. Like there's 2 voices in the middle somewhere that are a second apart, which is super crunchy. And so to have that for on every beat of the bar, like the very first G sharp in the middle there is a second away from the F sharp in the bass, and then the next beat there's a G sharp and an A, which are right beside each other, and then a B and a C sharp, and so just like he's not afraid to really get crunchy with the harmony, and like figuring out how to wield that tool so that it sounds beautiful like it does in this tune, and not like a complete mess like it would if I tried to do it. That's there's a lot to learn here for sure.
That's crazy. How do you think he does it? How does he do it? How does Jake Kaufman do it? The dude is not even like he I don't know if you know anything about the dude, but he based on the interviews I've seen, apparently he dropped out of school. He hasn't any classical education. He just loves music and video games music so much that he just taught himself all this stuff. How do people do that?
Well, he must just
like, what even is that?
He must he probably just has an ungodly ear, I would say. Yeah. As for something like this especially, like he must just have to be able to hear every voice and like have that intuition of where should this voice go next? What note is the right note for this voice to move to next? Like I mean, some people just have that in their brains,
That's it. Just absolutely blows my mind. There's a Twitch series where he actually streamed the entire process of him. Oh yeah,
Really?
he streamed the entire process of him composing the Shovel Knight soundtrack, and the insane part. And I watched. I mean, I tried to watch it one day, but dude, it's like 6 straight hours of him just at a tracker composing, and he does not move, he does not sleep, he does not eat, he does not go to the bathroom. He's just there for like in his chair for like 6 hours in the zone. And the crazy part is that he's kind of like narrating what he's doing as he's talking, and he apparently like for tunes like this, he hears everything in his head. Like he just hears it all in his head, and he's like, okay, and he'll stop for a second and like kind of bob his head, and like he'll look at the ceiling and kind of like think about it for a second, and then he'll be like, okay, I got it, and he'll just put it all down in the tracker.
See, I'm so the opposite of that. I can't do that at all, and I think that's like why I made my channel pretty much is because I don't have that, transcription is kind of a way to outsource that skill to other people.
What do you mean? Like
I don't know what
do
you
you
come
mean
next.
exactly? Unpack that a little bit.
Like I wouldn't know how to write this tune, but he wrote it, and so I can put it down on paper and look at it and see how to write this tune. You know what I mean? And so then if I'm trying to write something and I'm like, I want to write something that just evokes that sort of like heart-wrenching feeling, then it's like, oh, well, he crams these super crunchy seconds into a bunch of his chords. Maybe I'll try that. And like, I think that's where that kind of gut-wrenching emotion comes from. Or if you look at the melody, it's like these huge leaps of like, in bar 4, that C sharp up to B down to A, like that's such a beautiful leaping up of a 7th and then resolving down. Like that's just such a beautiful melodic figure. And so like, oh, well, I could try putting a huge 7th leap into my melody and see if that, kicks up the emotion.
Right.
Like it's a very inorganic process, I guess.
No,
but,
it's a
but
dude, that is brilliant, because your channel and our conversations and reading books about everyone steals from everyone else, and so it's like that you really do have to play the part of a scientist to be like, okay, I have a hypothesis that leaping up to the 7th and resolving back down creates a certain mood, and I'm gonna try that, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, but the fact that you have the evidence here, you have the transcription here that you can use as source material is everything. So if there's anything that people listening take away, it's transcribe music, transcribe it. Just do it. Just freaking do it, because oh my gosh, it's gonna change your life. Oh man, you and I might be the only people who get so excited about transcription in the world.
Yeah, well, that'll change once everyone reads your amazing blog post.
Oh, stop it.
Which I fully endorse.
Well, thank you very much.
It was enchanting.
My name is 8-Bit, and I approve this message.
Yeah.
Dude, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this call. I hope that everyone listening learned something, learned many things, and I would love to do it again sometime. So thank you so much. Do you have any parting words, any parting wisdom? We are at your feet. You are the guru. We've climbed to the top of the mountain pleading for your wisdom. Do you have anything for us, sir?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. This is a lot of fun. Of course. Very much enjoyed it. Hope we can do it again soon.
Naturally.
And I have so much wisdom to impart that I can hardly choose what wisdom to impart first.
That's right. How about the second one?
The second
piece of
second
wisdom.
most wise thing. You know what? If you enjoy music, that's great.
Yep. Well, this has been just a blast. This has been awesome. Do you hear that, folks? You heard it here, okay? If you quote, if you enjoy music, that's great, end quote.
I support enjoying music.
Fantastic. Great. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Bit. And I genuinely look forward to our next encounter. You can get all the transcriptions as well as references to all these videos in the show notes. And thank you all for joining. Thanks for listening to Composer Code. And we'll see you next time.